Who lives in a cargo ship on top of the sea? Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of this Eunuchs album, Harbour Century. Something is in the water, y'all, and I'm not just talking about the boats on this album cover. If you are at all a fan of underground rock music, you most likely have noticed as of late a trend of bands with some very eccentric parallels all kind of cropping up at once. I'm talking about groups with a penchant for long, winding, experimental, progressive art rock tunes, topped with intense lead vocals that range in performance style from singing to screaming to spoken word. Bands such as Black Midi, Sprain, Black Country New Road, as well as Maruja come to mind. And look, I don't just mean to frame this up-and-coming Sydney rock collective as if they are trend hoppers or something like that. I mean, they've been at this for a minute now. This is their second full-length LP. But I think what bands such as Eunuchs are doing right now has been in the making for a while. Because while the hipper alternative side of the contemporary rock music scene through the 2010s wasn't super prog or experimental rock centric, among the fans and listeners, there was still no shortage of love for things like the most extravagant prog rock albums of the 70s, all the 90s and 2000s classics that defined the post-rock genre from bands like Slint and Godspeed. Let's not also forget the game-changing comeback run that Swans had from 2010 to about 2016. And in this review, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't at least try to account for modern avant-auteurs such as John Zorn, or Scott Walker, or Mike Patton, or Toby Driver. My point ultimately is it was only a matter of time before all of these sounds evolved into something else for a new generation of musicians, maybe even converging a little bit too, which is why I think this Eunuchs album here is hitting at exactly the right place and the right time. And for sure, the sound of this record, the influences going into it are absolutely in my wheelhouse, which is why this record caught my attention to begin with. But the more I listened to it, the more I just kind of felt like, in terms of execution, it sort of falls short. I mean, for sure, the band is on its way to something grandiose and awe-inspiring potentially, but I think the ideas and skills going into this record aren't really living up to the ambitions it has. I mean, first off, the vocals and singing on this album. For a record in this style, I think they're imperative because you're not really just singing, you're acting as well in a way, as a means of locking the audience into the very long narrative and abstract poetry that you're pretty much smothering them with. And often I found a lot of the writing on this LP to be too indirect in order to just kind of keep me engrossed in everything they're saying, maybe with the exception of the opening track, which reads like the insane ramblings of a mad sea captain. And this guy's crew, as well as just the people generally on his ship, are very much the victims of his crazy, violent, uncontrolled behavior. And while I do think the storytelling and relentless screams on the song are most definitely there, the singing not quite as much, as the clean vocals on this track and really throughout the LP are notably much weaker than the more aggressive ones, to the point where it sounds like I'm kind of listening to a bad rock opera. And it doesn't really help that on the second track of the record, the narrative starts getting so convoluted that you can't really glean much from the song outside of these gargantuan, blurting, massive horn layers, which I do think there's something to, but these orchestral bits that Eunuchs just really piles on to pretty much all of the tracks on this record, there's not really much breathing room from them. There's no real reprieve, so often their presence kind of wears its welcome after a while. And while mixing and layering and arranging all of these various horn parts most certainly took a lot of time, a lot of focus, and a lot of effort, the end result is that they just kind of feel like this overbearing distraction from the songs at the core of these tracks. Following this, we have more weak musical theater singing on Estuary of Dreams, which is a track that kind of feels like it just exists to slowly pile on more little instrumental tidbits that kind of just takes on more grand layers as it escalates. Meanwhile, another track from the record that was in fact a single siren may not be as novel as it comes across, with some elements of glam rock in the mix, as well as kind of this schmaltzy, baroque, weirdo pop that feels like the early work of Man with a few ba-ba-ba-ba breaks that are very Brian Wilson-esque. On tracks like this, there's also a serious lack of musical ideas sticking with me throughout the song, because the structure is so winding and constantly changing. Even when you do get a good idea or two thrown at you, the band doesn't really give them any time or room to breathe or grow or develop. It's always just kind of on to the next thing. Conversely, Magnificent Stallion does seem to gain back some coherence on the song structure side, with some pretty strong refrains, though I will say the singing still continues to sound like it's more concerned with being eccentric as opposed to kind of being on point. It's still just very sloppy. The same shortcomings and dynamics continue throughout the rest of the album. However, I probably should make mention of the record's 17-minute closing track, Heroin King, which is indulgent on a level that makes pretty much every other song on this album sound like it's pop or just easy listening. Between the harps and very heavy, slow, simple, dirgy piano parts and the gravelly spoken word vocals that are very dark and dramatic, this one is going to test your patience if you are not fully engrossed and invested in the narrative the record has been on up until this point. But I mean, even as somebody who is kind of following along, I have to say I'm like not really blown away, and I feel like inadvertently what Eunuchs is showing us here is just how difficult it is to make a song that is 15, 20, or 30 minutes long and have it end up being genuinely coherent and engaging from front to back, even if you seemingly have the means to do it, and even some compelling lyrical themes to work in along the way, like the downfall of a surly, power-hungry character whose life is built on drugs and a system of haves and have-nots, which all kind of falls apart in a very Emperor Has No Clothes type fashion, which I'm not going to kind of spoil what's going on any further than that. You'll have to listen to it for yourself. But yeah, what's making this album fall short is difficult to put into words because there is so much going into it. To this album's credit, it is under an hour in length, but still, somehow it feels much longer, as I do think the finer details in the arrangements, in the song structures, in the singing are all kind of lacking, and those shortcomings are kind of just being pasted over with a lot of huge horn sections, a lot of big, showy instrumental arrangements, which I think is the most succinct way of explaining why it's not quite doing it for me. I am feeling, though, a strong 5 to a light 6 on this record.
Ahoy, ahoy, oh captain, my captain.
Ahoy, ahoy.
Permission to come aboard this review.
Well, the review's over. There's pretty much not anything else to do now other than transition. I hate this hum in the background of the video. Have you mission, volition, interstition, bishin, forever.